Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Can imagination have more concrete reality than our daily lives? Is it possible that we really are at the center of the universe? What does it all mean for the paranormal?
Hello, and welcome to the 339th broadcast of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. I'm Ben, and those questions came from my co-host and partner in the paranormal, my dad. So we have a really mind-bending show for you this evening. But before we introduce our guest, let's get to our weekly paranormal contest. So last week's question was, in Jewish folklore, what is the name for a humanoid being made from inanimate material?
Well, Indira Makris of Grand Junction, Colorado, was the first to answer that question correctly, and the answer was the Golem. It's not Gollum from Lord of the Rings, Gollum with an E, not a U. Right.
So anyway, this week's question is, where in Canada would you find a haunted trolley car inside a restaurant? So be first to get that right and win a copy of Footsteps in the Attic, my dad's most popular book.
Now, call us locally from anywhere at 401-766-1240 or from anywhere in the U.S. at 800-449-1240. If nobody answers the question during the show and you'd still like to give it a shot, drop us an email at paul@behindtheparanormal.com or ben@behindtheparanormal.com. Now to our guest. Patrick Harpur could be described as an insatiable seeker after meaning, my words, but briefly, in his words, quote, I left school, traveled in Africa, went to Cambridge University, then did part-time jobs to fund my quest for truth. Reading C.J. Jung was a turning point. Did 5 years in publishing, and at age 32 became a writer, publishing 2 novels before embarking on my attempt to get to grips with what we might call the Western esoteric tradition. My interim reports on this quest have come out in 4 books. The first, an account of alchemy, is Mercurius, or the Marriage of Heaven and Earth. The second is about apparitions, visions, and otherworldly journeys, and it's called Demonic Reality, a field guide to the otherworld. The third is a history of the imagination, the philosopher's secret file, and the latest is The Secret Tradition of the Soul. That's the U.S. edition. In the U.K. it's called, rather ambitiously, A Complete Guide to the Soul. Patrick lives in West Dorset, England, one of the most beautiful places I've ever been.
So Patrick Harpur, welcome to Behind the Paranormal.
Hi. Nice to be on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
Very good. Yeah, we've rigged up some technicalities here to get the overseas call, and thanks for staying up so late. It's 11 o'clock where you are.
Yeah, that's all right. Yeah,
Okay.
I've had some strong coffee. I'm ready to rock.
All right, so Patrick Harpur, you asked us not to ask you what the soul is because it took a whole book for you to answer it. So what is the secret tradition of the soul?
Well, it's a strange tradition. You know, it's a secret tradition, but it's a kind of an open secret. You know, it's been hidden, really. You know, I've had the best education money can buy, but it was never even mentioned at school. And that's part of its excitement, really. You have to kind of seek it out for yourself. It's not a philosophy, really. It's not a religion, but it does have a philosophical and spiritual side. It's not even a system of thought. It's more like a way of seeing the world, or better still, a way of imagining the world. In fact, some people call it the imaginative tradition. You know, a traditional culture would probably call it a shamanic tradition, and so on. And as you'd expect, this tradition has, in the history of Western culture at least, been pushed underground. You know, first of all, it was declared heretical by Christianity, and then, once again, after about 1600 or so, the modern scientific way of thinking rose up and either ignored this tradition or ridiculed it, you know, wrote it off as crazy or maybe at best as superstition. But it's neither of these things. And in fact, you could probably demonstrate that it's not these things, because it's worth mentioning, I think, that there have been at least 3 periods in history, in the history of the West, that is, when this very tradition has kind of surged up and broken the surface of orthodoxy and itself become the orthodoxy. It's become mainstream and so on. I could tell you which those periods are, if you like.
Yes, please do, because we were wondering when in history...
Yeah, you already started to answer the next question, so...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. When did we start to lose this, or did we lose it? Is it buried in the baggage that is carried in our spiritual traditions?
Well, it can't die out, because it is an immortal tradition and so on, and it's still carried on today, of course. But I suppose it became the orthodoxy. It's very much underground at the moment, but it became orthodoxy first of all, quite early on in the early centuries after Christ, when you got a fantastic culture springing up in Alexandria in Egypt, which was a Greek-speaking culture, and it had all these wonderful sort of groups and sects and beliefs, Gnostics and Hermetic philosophers and Stoics and so on. But chief among them was probably the Neoplatonists, that is, followers of the great Greek philosopher Plato, who'd lived 500 years before, especially one called Plotinus and so on. And they were more or less the orthodox way of thinking in the ancient world at that time. Amongst these groups, of course, were the Christians. They were still just a minority group at the time. But of course, by about 330, they'd become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and all these other pagan sects, like the Neoplatonists, which are so dear to my heart, were declared heretical. So they went underground, and all the Greek learning was completely lost for 1,000 years. The West just didn't have it. It disappeared. It was preserved amongst the Arabs, but it was lost. But it was rediscovered again in the Renaissance, in 15th century Italy. That's when the forgotten Greek authors, especially people like Plotinus and Plato, were discovered again, and they occasioned yet another great sort of flowering of imaginative life and so on. This is directly traceable to one man, a man called Marsilio Ficino, who started up an academy in Florence in Italy, kind of in imitation of Plato's original academy in Athens all those centuries before. And he was a translator and interpreter of Greek thought, and it became all the rage in Europe and influenced all the great artists that we think of when we think of the Renaissance, Michelangelo and Leonardo and people like that. Of course, inevitably then, the new modern way of thinking rose up, after about 1600, and this tradition was pushed underground yet again. But you couldn't keep it down. It kind of surged up again amongst the Romantics, the Romantics who espoused imagination. I ought to emphasize that this tradition, one of its hallmarks is that it believes that soul is central to everything, and that the chief faculty of the soul is not, for instance, reason, as the Enlightened would say, or as Christians would say, the rational soul, but imagination and so on. And that's why it surged up again with the Romantics, with the German philosophers, and then above all with the English poets, Blake and Shelley and Keats and Wordsworth and Coleridge, especially Coleridge, and even up until the 20th century, Yeats, W.B. Yeats, the great Irish poet, was the last great Romantic poet. I ought to mention too that perhaps the last person to really expound this tradition was C.G. Jung, the great depth psychologist, and his followers, people like James Hillman over there in America. And that's where we've got to. And I regard myself as a very, very humble link in what the alchemists call this golden chain. Or the alchemists who kept this tradition alive for 500 years when it was gone underground.
Well, certainly a very articulate one. You've touched on something that we, oddly enough, and I began to run into 42 years ago when I started paranormal research, and that is the problem of what, for those out there who don't have philosophy degrees, dualism, the issue of essentially the war, at least in Western Christian circles and Western thinking in general, the war between matter and spirit, I suppose we could say. And
one of the leaders being Rene Descartes, of course.
Not one of our favorite people, founder of dualism. Yeah, exactly. And what very few people realize that we always get into lively debates with people of the caliber of our guest today, Patrick Harpur, and they'll say, well, you can't really argue with Descartes because he came up with the fundamental formula for knowledge. I think, therefore I am. But toward the end of his life, actually on his deathbed, he said even that wasn't good enough. We really don't know anything. Hence the motto of this show: everything you know is wrong. Okay, there may be a bit of an exaggeration, but we constantly run into the problem in paranormal research of people assuming that, say, on that level, ghosts are spirits of the dead. We don't know any such thing. How can a spirit have the full consciousness of an entire being? And questions like that we always ask, and everybody goes, huh, what? So, you can see where, perhaps even on the level that we're operating, Patrick, that the issues you have brought up that have vexed human thinking forever, pretty much, are still present, even on that level, and therefore implying that it's present on every level of human life today, that people have a false view of reality.
Yes, I think that the paranormal level is a very important level, and I think the Neoplatonists, who are at the root of my tradition, have much to say about this, because they believe that the whole universe was really made of soul stuff, and and the idea of soul, they believe that the world had a soul, which they called the soul of the world, which is a very beautiful idea.
Yes.
And it's essentially an intellectual version of what all traditional cultures believe, all animist cultures. They believe that what we now think of as an inanimate world was in fact animate, from the Latin anima, meaning a soul, that everything had souls, and that the souls of natural things were, they called them daimons, or daemons, not to be confused with demons,
yes,
which is what Christians turned them into. And it was these daimons that you could see, and that appeared to you in visions and apparitions. And of course, the interesting thing about these daimons is that they weren't spirits. All tribal cultures believe in daimons, but the anthropologists have confused us by calling them spirits, which implies that they're kind of ethereal. But the daimons had a material side to them. They were both. They were completely paradoxical creatures. They were always both spiritual and material. So, like any occupant of a UFO, they could give you a nasty blast, and you could feel the physical effects. But at the same time, then they were suddenly gone. That you couldn't pin them down.
Exactly. Yeah.
They were elusive, marginal, shape-shifting creatures, and they played an absolutely crucial part in the Neoplatonic scheme of things, because they connected us to the gods. Or rather, they may well have themselves been the faces that the gods show to us, as it were.
Yes. Well, this is what we run into all the time. The physical effects are striking. The old spiritualist ideas are not good enough. And we constantly run into quote-unquote ghosts. And we spend years on projects. And lately it's been leading us right into quote-unquote UFOs and the grays and all the whatever labels you want to put on these things. And the only possible explanation, I would think, is a complete wholeness and unity to the entire fabric of reality.
Well, as dysfunctional as it may seem, it is it is harmonious in its own right. I mean,
it's elegant in a very disheveled kind of way.
Yeah. There's always some sort of element of harmony. You need the good with the bad, and even if things seem horrible, there's always good to it.
So your suggestion, Patrick, is that the world around us is not what our five senses tell us necessarily.
Well, absolutely not.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, but
perhaps fortunately, depends on what you see.
Well, fortunately, yes. Yeah. But I just go along with what all traditional cultures have always believed, and which our own culture believed before Descartes and dualism and so on, which is that that we are part of the universe, that we participate in it, and that universe is ensouled and indeed is full of daimonic creatures. But they're not beings of, they're constantly contradicting themselves. For instance, my tradition is Irish because my father was Irish, and he himself saw Irish fairies, for instance. But, they're not just beings of, that are benign. They can also be malign as well. That's another contradiction they have.
Very much so. Yeah.
So we have to come to terms with the fact the universe isn't quite as we've been taught. That it isn't that we've tended to divide it and polarize it into angels and demons. But the old daemons were both these things, were both angelic and sometimes, well, they were never diabolic, I have to say, but they could be very mischievous and tricky. They're tricksters, and shapeshifters, and so it's very hard to pin them down. And, I attempted to grapple with these creatures in my book, Daimonic Reality, which I talk about all kinds of visions and apparitions and other world journeys from the traditional daemons of Europe, the elves and the trolls and the fairies, all the way up to UFOs and little grey aliens and abductions and so on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's it. Unfortunately, I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. We didn't have a chance to do so with all the sort of dualistic dishevelment in our own schedule.
It's been a rough week.
But I have been reading Graham Hancock, is a friend of ours and has been on the show several times, and he suggests that people discover. I think he thinks very much along some of the lines you do. He suggests that. And I hate to bring it up almost because of the trouble with this subject, but that hallucinogenic drugs or plants may have been responsible, at least in part, for the birth of the shamanic phenomena, of the shamanic class of people 20 to 40 to 50,000 years ago, or maybe even longer, who began to discover what is a reality that we've been talking about, but sort of proved the door. Do you subscribe to that at all?
Well, I wouldn't be dogmatic about it because, there are many ways of entering the other world. And, in South America, they favor all kinds of hallucinogenic drugs. That's their system. But in Siberia and Mongolia, they don't. They prefer to dance and drum and sing, know.
Yes.
And, but, you can equally do it by fasting and praying.
Exactly.
There are all sorts of techniques for entering an altered state.
That's essentially how we do it.
Fly into the other world. So, I think you pays your money, you takes your choice on that one. So I would hesitate to assert that, human culture began one way or another, Well,
I tend to agree.
But I wouldn't rule out drugs. There's a controversial notion that the Greek mysteries were, for instance, sort of fueled by, the fly agaric mushroom, which grows under birch trees in Europe, and that has hallucinogenic properties. But it's not proven, but, it's a good idea, and it may have some truth in it.
Excuse me. The two shamans I knew best in days of yore were, one was from Australia, an Aboriginal elder, and another one was a Cree elder from Quebec, and neither of them, and I was fortunate to be even for that they'd even talk to me, that they're very often are very wary of outsiders. And neither of them in all our long conversations ever mentioned hallucinogenics, at least not as a door to what they do. They themselves simply had done it so often as far as using the power of what we might say traversing the boundaries of alternate realities or parallel worlds, that they simply could almost do it at will. And
sure.
So that's essentially when. So I suppose the tradition varies. What does all this do to the scientific method that we cherish so dearly?
What does it do? Well, I wouldn't be against science. I'm reasonable.
No, nor are we.
I have reason to be grateful to it in many, many ways.
Sure.
And so on. But but I think in many ways. science is the trouble with science is that it goes beyond its remit. It tries to. It's okay when it stays science, but when it becomes scientism, it becomes an ideology, I think, which goes too far and, frankly, pokes its nose into things which don't concern it. And I think its besetting sin is that of literalism. It takes everything literally. And so, if, for instance, you say, oh, well, the daemons exist in this world, in this strange paradoxical form, they'll say, well, bring me the proof, and you can't, and there are all kinds of things which just can't be proved according to its reductive methods. But the imaginative world is a real world, When I use the word imagination, I don't use it in the way it's now used now. It's now used because we now think of it as a kind of just something, a faculty that creative children have, or else a way of summoning up objects into our minds which aren't present to our senses, or something like that. But to the Romantics, it was a whole realm, completely separate from us. It was autonomous, it had its own laws, and it was dynamic and vital, and what it did was generate images. It generated what Jung called archetypes, or what the Greeks called gods. And these interact in the archetypal stories of the soul, which we call myths, and so on. Mm-hmm. So I think that, myths have an incalculable importance, that they are the true stories of the soul, and that there are perhaps, a limited number of them, and that we go on telling those stories over and over again. And that even science has stories of a kind, but in a sense, science is also underwritten by myths, but what it does is it takes its myths literally.
Yes.
And claims that they're fact, but they're not necessarily fact, that we live in a world of myths and stories, and we choose to take some literally and some not, but really there are no untrue stories.
No, that's true.
Stories are true in some sense.
We often refer to, at least in my last book, I referred to myth and folklore as the vessel of the memory of the human race. Yes. To speak with any student of folklore, they will inevitably tell you that there was some basis to even the silliest legend. And Ben and I are often, we've done several shows on fairies and little people and all this stuff, and it's the word fairy that invites disbelief, but the actual reality could be something entirely different. So
but the thing is, where did that disbelief come from?
Well, exactly. What do you mean, where did the legend come from?
No, well, the disbelief of said legend.
Oh, that's a good point, yeah. Well, perhaps Patrick has a thought on that. Why the hostility?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you there.
Oh, no, Ben was suggesting that what's the reason for the hostility to words like fairy or some of the concepts that are associated with it, even though they may certainly have reality in the human memory.
Yeah, it's hard to know what happened. They definitely get knocked on the head at a very specific point in history, around the time of Descartes.
Oh, there he is again.
And there was a philosopher called Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes.
Sure.
Oh, yeah. Thomas
Hobbes. Hobbes. He wrote Leviathan, and at the end of that book, there's this extraordinary diatribe against popular beliefs in. He says we're just not having all these fairies and gnomes and goblins and hobgoblins and boggarts and shrikes and trashes and and he runs through all these. He says this is just superstition that our nursemaids tell us to frighten us. But he doesn't reason about it, and he's the master of the logical system. He just kind of slams his fist on the table and says, we're not having it. And I think in a way, the whole of Europe got too infested by these daemons, that they did become slightly oppressive, so that suddenly the scientific view seemed like a breath of fresh air. That was the cutting edge thing to be. And even you and I, Paul, would probably be scientists in those days, because it could be very oppressive, the idea that the whole of nature is just full of, as some tribes suffer, they suffer from this, that the whole of the wilderness around them is full of spirits of ancestors or unruly daemons or taboos or ghosts or evil spirits. You just get oppressed.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it was just a kind of a change in consciousness. But now we've taken that too far and outlawed them altogether.
Exactly.
But of course you can't outlaw them. You can't outlaw them. They're immortal, so they come back. They came back in the great craze for spiritualism in Victorian times.
Well, did they ever? Yes. Well, we're going to take.
Sorry.
No, I said we're going to need to take a commercial break right now. But we'll be right back. You're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and ONWorldwide.com in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. We'll be right back with our guest, Patrick Harpur. Stay with us.
Curious about what's ahead for you in 2012? Guess. Or you can get a personalized astrological chart, setting you in the right direction, helping you to make those important decisions and choices. Fulfill your ambitions and achieve your goals. Move forward with confidence into the future this year, learning how to handle the new long-term planetary trends influencing your daily life. Money, health, job, your relationships, all included. Call me at 401-333-4048 for information on getting your chart or having a yearly update on a chart I've previously done for you. Put the spotlight on the future. Be a winner, not a worrier. Contrary to rumors you've been hearing about the world coming to an end in 2012, if it should, I'll give you a full refund. That's how sure I am it's not going to happen. I'm also available for private parties and speaking engagements. Call me 333-4048.
Well, there you have it, folks. I also wanted to remind you about the Blackstone Valley Tourism Council, our local people who are working very hard to build up the tourism in the Blackstone Valley. Check it out online. tourblackstone.com. Wonderful group of folks led by Bob Millington, and of course our own Dave Balfour from the station is the head of the board. I serve on the board myself, and there's a lot going on in the Blackstone Valley. Take advantage of it. It's a wonderful place to live, to work, and to be. Okay, let's get back to our subject here, and our guest, Patrick Harpur, British author par excellence, and we're talking about really the history of human imagination, I suppose. Imagination as something very, very real, not something ethereal. So let's get a little deeper into this, Patrick. In your study of this subject, of the human experience of the daemonic in the positive sense of the word, have you noticed patterns, cycles, in the sense of certain periods in that reality end, certain periods begin? Now, you've mentioned historical cycles of belief and disbelief and different interpretations, but what about among the daemons, so to speak, themselves? Have you noticed in those worlds patterns and cycles that might affect ours? I know it's a funny question, but...
Well, it's very hard to pin them down. They are shape-shifting, so they shape-shift in themselves. So I think you could make a good case for the aliens from outer space being, a shape-shifted version of the old fairies. I think, and it's interesting that they're kind of symmetrical with each other. There's amongst the folklorists, there's this belief that the fairies, but whenever they ask people about fairies, they say, "Oh no, nobody believes them anymore," and that's part of the tradition itself. That the monks in 6th century Ireland were being told that no one believes them anymore, and people in the 15th century were being told that no one believes them anymore. And then, researchers in the 20th century were told that no one believes them anymore. But they still persist. People still do believe in them. So in a sense, they're going, but never gone.
Yes.
And this has a kind of inversion in the myth of the alien invasion, which is always coming, but never here. They've kind of
maybe not. Yeah.
What?
Maybe not.
Well, maybe not. Yes. Okay. Okay. I'll give you that one. But but the daemons like to shapeshift historically. If you drive them out of one place, they'll reappear in another. So if you drive them out of nature, as happened in the 17th century, then it's then that they take refuge in the human mind itself, because Descartes divided the world into two, into the subject and the object, into us and the world. And if the daemons weren't allowed in the world, they had to hide it behind us. They hid behind our consciousness. In other words, they hid in the unconscious. But I would go further. I would say they didn't so much hide in the unconscious as form the unconscious, because we had no notion of an unconscious before the 17th century.
Yes.
And they lay there until they were, dug up, until they made themselves heard, really, at the turn of the, around 1900, when psychology was discovered. It was discovered because the daemons were crying out again with alien voices from the couches of the psychoanalysts, and that's where they were, and they cried out with completely autonomous voices. So they became complexes and archetypes of the unconscious. I would also argue that they became the subatomic particles. I mean, I think that if you want to describe what a daemon's like, you couldn't do better than describe an electron, which is both there and not there, which is both material and yet energy, which is both wave and particle, which is highly elusive, fast-moving, shape-shifting, strange. They all behave like fairies, and the deeper we go into matter, the more demonic the world seems, the more outrageous it is. The fairy stories of science are far more outrageous than any folklore.
I've always thought of particle physics on that level as an icon, as it were, of the subconscious.
I'm sorry, could you say again?
I've always rather thought of the subatomic world, the quantum world, as an icon, so to speak, of the imagination, or of reality, and you've just sort of confirmed that in a sense.
Yes, that's right. If you look at things like black holes, no matter whatever. I'm not going to the other end of the scale, to the very big, not the very small, but they read like the versions of space that the cosmologists give us read like fairy tales. They're full of strange ogres and strange other worlds where time goes backwards, and where there is a world of dark matter and so on threatening us, a bit like Jung's shadow.
Indeed,
the idea
yes.
that what is unknown in the unconscious projects itself onto the outside world and becomes a sort of dark patch in the universe, and in this case, 80% of the unknown universe, whatever it is.
Indeed.
So, I do see the universe as a kind of as an imaginative construct. We get the universe that we deserve, really. And
Edmund Burke of physics, yeah.
And it's not too good at the moment. And it's interesting too that the cosmologists always describe the universe as hostile. But this, of course, is something that no inanimate universe could ever be. That daemonic language creeps back in through the back door without them being aware of it.
Perhaps it is that we fear the demonic or the unknown, and so we fear it because we can't control it. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case, because if you're very rationalistic, I mean, it's a kind of a nightmare.
Yeah. And
also one of our modern diseases is that we think everything's a problem that we've got to solve. Whenever anything strange or paranormal occurs, experts are always put up to explain it away. But, it never really works too well. But we've lost the idea that some things are just mysteries, and that the whole point of mysteries is you don't try and kind of solve them. You enter into them, and you're transformed in the process. The whole point of a mystery is that you have to do away with your rational ego, which is so controlling, and open yourself up to a larger, more expanded consciousness of the world.
That's an experience I had early on in my own work. I started paranormal research 42 years ago when I was a student for the priesthood, and you can now net with all the preconceptions that came with that sort of education.
Yes.
And because my background being theological and philosophical. And I quickly learned in the trenches, when I actually confronted these things, that none of that was good enough. The theology wasn't good enough. The spiritualist approach, as I said previously, was not good enough. There was much more to this. So over the decades, and now Ben shares this with me, we have come to the conclusion that we are literally swimming in the human unconscious, the subconscious being made of infinite numbers of worlds and possibilities, and the reality we've discussed this evening, and in which we are intimately involved. And I think that's a critical point, that this isn't something outside of ourselves. It's within us, and we're within it.
Yes, I quite agree. I couldn't agree more, really. And indeed, I mean, the idea that the imagination and the unconscious are within us is an eccentric idea. You know, that's completely modern. In the olden days, you know, it was just thought to be an other world that was somehow around us or parallel to us or just out of reach, you know. And I'd rather prefer that idea than the idea of the unconscious. You know, I think we should perhaps disinter it a bit.
Yes. Let's go a little bit further with this. We've got a little time here. There are people who often will write to us and say, I really don't feel that we belong here, or that I belong here. There's a certain sense of detachment. Now, of course, in some of these, one can detect the textbook definitions of possible schizophrenia or whatever, the sense of detachment and alienation and all this business. But there are some who, the majority seem to be very sincere and seem to have an approach that lends credibility to what they're saying. There seems to be some school of thought here and there that our species as it exists today is not even perhaps indigenous to this planet. And what I'm getting at is it possible that in the development of the human tapestry of our history, in our origins, in the fact that the human genome has 223 genes that shouldn't be there, if evolution as we understand it is correct. I mean, does all this lend itself to the possibility of outside interference, whether from aliens from other planets, or more likely, in my opinion, demonic realities from within us and outside us, you know, having actual physical effects upon our history? I mean, you see what I'm getting at here? What's your opinion on that?
Yes. Well, you know, I'm very loath to be a literalist in these things,
yes.
You know, in any field. So, you know, I wouldn't rule anything out, but I wouldn't even take the theory of evolution literally. You know, I think it's a myth, and you know, it may be a fact as well, but well, that's another story. But but I think the sense that we're from somewhere else is a very common idea. I mean, I think we all have that kind of inkling in our childhood that our parents aren't our real parents, or that we were left there by gypsies, or that we're really princes and princesses. You know, it's a kind of a fantasy we all have, and I would kind of tend to read this as that dim knowledge that we carry into the world because according to Plato, we've come from the immortal world to which we return at death. That we carry with us a remembrance of that immortal world, that we know that we are immortals, and that our stay on earth is only a temporary one, because we're going to return to the great soul of the world, or to God, or whatever you'd like to call it, you know. And this stay on earth is a brief sojourn that we make here. And so there is always a part of us, the immortal part of us, will always feel that homesickness for somewhere else, for a more perfect eternal world, you know, and will not feel that it belongs on this earth, you know, that it will feel that it belongs somewhere else. and somewhere better. Does that make sense?
It does. It does.
And that all kind of sort of factual beliefs that we come from other planets is a kind of literalization of that ageless yearning for the other world and for the great imaginative riches which that holds.
Now, there are a lot of people listening to this show right now who are stuck in traffic in one of the cities around here, or just maybe tuning in for the first time, or whatever. How does one, in all practicality, get beyond all that? How does one get beyond the artificial daily lives we have created for ourselves to the spiritual richness that is implied in the vision we were talking about this evening?
Well, I'm a great believer in. I think there's been too much spirituality myself. In fact, in my book about the soul, I make a very stern distinction between spirit and soul. That spirit is always trying to get away from the world and trying to transcend it and trying to meditate or detach itself or whatever. But soul isn't like that. Soul is interested in the downward path. It's interested in the labyrinth of the unconscious. It's interested in the world itself. It thinks that that soul is embedded in the world, and so it takes a poetic view. So one shouldn't try and transcend the world, but pay more attention to this world, because one can see the eternal world through this world, if you like. The great example of this is William Blake, the Romantic poet, who says, to see heaven in a grain of sand. No, or is it, and eternity in a wild flower, something like that, And that is the poetic route, that you pay minute attention to this world and lose yourself. Get rid of your ego cravings by attention to this world. Writing poetry and painting is a good idea for this, And it's quite different from spiritual disciplines, which want to empty itself of images. But I prefer the way of going through images, using the images of the world to attain some kind of happy relationship with it.
I like that.
And chief amongst that is the perception of beauty, is always to be looking for beauty and to use one's imagination to the full rather than denying one's imagination, denying the sensory world. I go into that in much more detail. It's very proper. You're not asking easy questions, Paul. These are very fundamental things, and
that's what we do on this show.
I can't. Yeah, it's great stuff, but I can't. I don't know that I could say more than that in a soundbite.
Well, as Cyril of Alexandria once, Cyprian of Carthage once said, all theology or all intellect ends in silence eventually. So, but you've been very extremely articulate. Bringing up one of the fathers of the Eastern Church makes me think that perhaps Eastern Christianity is a far better reflection, flawed as it may be, of much that you have described. There is despite the Greek influence on it, philosophically, there is a true notion of the depth to which you have brought us to thinking about things like the world as what we make it. Total transformation, restoration of the icon of the best sense, the daemonic, as we've discussed it this evening.
Yes.
So that's.
I don't know anything about Eastern Orthodox Christianity really, except that whenever I encounter it in a glancing way, like going to Greece, I always think how fantastic it is. Wonderful singing, and wonderful icons, and this wonderful sense of holiness and the transparency of holiness to this world. Which I agree, which seems to be a feature of their worship.
Well, that's true, yeah. I was fortunate enough to study in one of their seminaries. Ironically, they're the ones who threw me out because they didn't like my paranormal work. But that was in the age of the film of the Exorcist, and people were all paranoid. But in any case, I was privileged enough to study in the seminary there, and it's a real eye opener from many points of view. But certainly, we're coming down to the end of the show here, and it's been a tremendous conversation. Patrick, tell us about your books, where people can get them, your website, etc.
Oh, sure. Yes. Yeah, my website is, all my books are on it. It's, what is it? It's www.harper.org.
There you go. That's it.
And I have to say that Harper is spelled Harpur.
Right.
Which is, it's not ER, but UR. And, I think I think at least 4 of my books are available in the States. I've got a very nice publisher over in Seattle who did my book Daemonic Reality, which is the one which perhaps has most relevance to the paranormal. But my History of Imagination is, I think, my masterpiece, if I can use that word, without sounding immodest, which took me 30 years to write. And then my latest book is The Secret Tradition of the Soul, which is all about the soul and what happens to us when we die and things like that.
Certainly stuff for another show.
Which is a whole other ball game, I'm afraid.
Indeed. Well, we'll get into that in another show because we're definitely going to have you back. But
okay, so
one final question, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know if this will take up the rest of the show, but have you yourself had any paranormal experiences?
Oh, I wish I had. No, I'm not a very psychic person. Although I had hopes for myself, since my grandmother was a very fine trance medium, and my father, who wasn't at all fey, he was a hard-headed businessman, but he saw fairies twice in Ireland when he was a young man. So I had hopes, but I haven't seen anything apart from a couple of ghosts, and that's it.
Well, our point of view on the paranormal is that it is nothing of the kind. It is every day, and I think very often when you put your keys down, for example, and you turn around and they're not there, you find them somewhere else. You say, well, that's one of those things we don't think about it, but in our experience, it's the nature, the Swiss cheese nature of the multiverse, so to speak, that we call paranormal, that these things happen all the time. And it's only when you get hit in the head by a dish thrown by a poltergeist that you notice it half the time.
Yeah, I could do a whole program on keys going missing. Yeah, my mother used to call it pixelation, and she was a great authority on that.
Excellent.
And that opens the fabric and the nature of reality, which you can drop through amazingly, and it's such a trivial thing, but it has so many important implications, I think.
No, we do it all the time. Do you know Paul Devereux by any chance?
Well, I've met Paul many years ago on several occasions, but I'm an admirer of his work, yes.
Yes, a certainly good friend of ours. And what are you working on next? What's your next project? Another book, or...?
Well, actually, I'm just finishing a book that's rather different. It's a novel based on the life and work of Søren Kierkegaard.
Really?
The Danish existential philosopher. It's like a kind of antidote to the paranormal,
We could use some of that.
It's kind of the opposite there. It's the spiritual end of things instead of the soul thing, I'm trying to get some hold into my life, Paul, but it's not easy.
No, never.
Being an obsessive maniac by nature,
Well, indeed. Well, Patrick, it's been an absolute delight to have you on. I hope it's the first of many visits. And
thank you very much.
Thank you again for staying up so late. And next time we have you on, I will have read hopefully all of your books, and we can continue our discussion. But certainly, we've scratched the surface this evening, I hope, and we will talk to you soon.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul.
Very good.
My pleasure. Bye now.
Bye now.
Bye.
Patrick Harpur, everyone. Okay. So I think we have time probably for one interesting email that came in. How much time do we have, Ben?
We have about 5 minutes.
Okay. This is a little long, but it had to do with our guest from last week. Why don't we perhaps begin?
Oh, okay.
This is from, she doesn't say where she's from, but her name is Kathy.
Okay, so Kathy writes, "Hi, Paul and Ben. I heard your show with Jeff Belanger, and I must say, I find his attitude a little disturbing. A Ouija board is most definitively not a toy. I, like you, have had contacted the game company, even if they never listen. I was hurt by a Ouija board when I was young. I believe it was a birthday present. Eventually, someone, if I remember rightly, gave my mom some good information, and the thing was gotten rid of. I had opened up some doors, and some parasitical stuff got attracted to me, and some pretty major, quote, lose your mind, unquote, sort of things occurred for quite a while, along the lines of abduction. I don't know what it is about the darned thing. The Ouija board, or the darned thing, the Ouija board being the darned thing, that it has caused so much trouble. I might, on occasion today, consult with a pendulum, but I would never get near a Ouija board again.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, there's a comment here. So back to Jeff, and we love Jeff. He lives near here. We just don't agree on much. He's the proprietor of GhostVillage.com, and it sort of encourages people to get involved in feral ghost hunting, as we call it, and we think that's a very.
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to read the rest of it, so.
Yeah, well, we can, but she makes some interesting points here, but she does say that she agrees with us that kids should not be getting involved in this, as he says. And he said if he had experienced just 15 minutes of what I went through, I bet he might think differently, and I tend to agree. But anyway, that's just a thought from a listener from last week's show, and you can take it for
what it is.
And we tend to agree with it. But anyway, so we want to point out certainly our show website, behindtheparanormal.com. You can buy my books on that site. You can subscribe to our newsletter. There are links to our guests' websites, including Patrick Harpur's tonight. And there's information about guests upcoming, guests in the past, and certainly a marvelous resource, we hope, for our shows. Over 400, nearly 400 podcasts, all free, are available at that site. So many thanks to our producer, young Ben himself here.
It's me.
Yep, and doing a fine job here as our producer, and we'll see you next Monday, May 7th, here on WOON, 1240 AM and ONWorldwide.com, when Ben and I will welcome prolific author, broadcaster, producer Paul McGuire to discuss cosmic warfare.
Well, that sounds interesting. So on our regular CBS radio edition on Sunday, May 6th, in Boston, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and Seattle, we'll be hosting the second of two panels with people who have reported alien contact, Tom Reed, Jesse Long, and Geraldine Stith.
It was very interesting last evening. I thought it was really something. Tom Reed and Jesse Long being abductees or reported abductees in one of these alien situations, and Geraldine Stith being the daughter of a person who experienced something really strange in Kentucky in 1955, and we did a whole show on it, the Hopkinsville, Kentucky incident, in which they literally had there was a UFO sighting, supposedly something landed in a nearby field, and they literally, it's not funny, but I mean, it can come across, had sort of almost a home invasion by these little green guys, and this everything, and they shot at them, and the bullets had no effect, which is something we find interesting, but there were a whole bunch of witnesses to that, and that was supposedly what occurred with that.
What's interesting to me is that Tom and Jesse have both had similar experiences, but they both came up with two completely different outcomes.
Well, Tom almost was very at home with it, and his son has all these remarkable abilities. And you're in touch with him, but I think you haven't quite connected yet, right?
Yeah. It's been weird. Like I've sent him an email, and then I guess it just never got there. Maybe I don't know. It's weird. I'll probably end up sending him another email soon. Yeah,
I'd like to. You guys are almost the same age. It would be interesting to have your points of view. And Tom himself, very much at peace with what occurred to them, and their whole family was involved in these abductions, supposedly. And then there's Jesse Long. His experience and his brothers were quite they were very similar, but in a way they were terrified by what happened. And there was. I guess we're out of time. I'm sorry. Well, we'll listen to next week's CBS show, and we'll talk more about that. Anyway, I leave you this evening with a quote from dear old Dr. Seuss, Theodore Seuss Geisel. Be who you are and say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind.
Thanks for sailing with us on a great cosmic journey, and we'll see you next time.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.